TikTok, it's time to rock. Welcome, ladies and gentlemen, to a special episode here on the channel. It's my pleasure to introduce, if you don't know who he is, Alan Garver is with us. And anytime I get a message from Alan saying, look, we got a bit of time, bro, what do you reckon? Let's organise, let's get together and talk about something on air. I'm going to say, Alan, I'll do anything I can.
I appreciate that so much because, you know, my time is so weird, you know, with my wife and kids and everything. And I just so happened I was, you know, saying off air that, yeah, my wife went out to do some shopping for a minute. And I've got just one of the kids. I've got my little boy, Miles, here with me. That's the only person in the house, and he's entertaining himself. So I got some time to chit chat. And I regret not being able to spend more time with you guys. But,
yeah,
you know, and we were talking a little while ago, you know, I made a couple of little discoveries, and I thought it might be fun to kind of, you know, go back and revisit some of the Led Zeppelin gear chat that I had done before. And I was going by specific albums, and I think we had left off, you know, finishing up like Led Zeppelin 2. I think we pretty much beat that dead horse pretty well. And then, you know, we could, you know, going on to the third album, you know, probably would be where I would pick up. But
sure.
You know, I had sent Andrew some notes, and I had kind of been doing some cross-referencing from the different books that we have available that, you know, have photographs and dates and studio logs and you know, kind of quotes, and you know, this all relates to the guitar that we previously, I and most people assumed was the likely guitar to have been used on Ramble On.
Yeah.
And so Rick Beato did a really great video, and I think most of us have seen it, that he had found a Vox branded version of the E-Ros Dakota 606 guitar that Jimmy was photographed with on April 14th, 1969 at the very first session for Led Zeppelin 2 at Olympic Studios. And that was for the song called La La, which was finally only released on the Super Deluxe edition of Led Zeppelin 2. And so there ended up being some quotes about that photo in the Led Zeppelin by Led Zeppelin book, which everyone should have. And then there was also references to those photos in Jimmy Page by Jimmy Page, and then also in Jimmy Page, the Anthology. And then, of course, also in the booklet, that's one of them. And also in the book, it's not a booklet, it's actually a good book, in the Led Zeppelin 2 Super Deluxe edition, which shows the actual session dates for those songs. And the interesting thing was, you know, Rick was going on the idea that the photograph of Jimmy with that E-Ros Dakota was a photograph of Ramble On, based on his hand positioning and based on the fact that it's one of only 2 photos that show Jimmy with an acoustic guitar around the time of the Led Zeppelin 2 sessions in the summer of 1969, when most of that was recorded.
Yeah.
So, but, you know, and Rick's video is fabulous, and he makes some convincing, you know, attempts at the sound. And I started cross-referencing all of these materials and the photographs, and, you know, again, realizing that photograph has been confirmed by Jimmy to have been from the session for La La at Olympic Studios, okay, April 14th of 1969. But the studio logs indicate that Ramble On was recorded at Groove Studios in New York in July of 1969. Now, Jimmy didn't bring all these instruments on the road with him, you know, so Jimmy did not have for instance, his 3 pickup Gibson Black Beauty guitar on the road with him when the majority of Led Zeppelin 2 was being recorded. You know, a lot of it was recorded in the States, in Canada, and then there was a trip back to the UK at the very end, you know, in 1969 around November to kind of finish up the album at Morgan Studios in London. But the thing is that Jimmy just didn't, you know, to the best of my knowledge, Jimmy didn't carry instruments with him other than the ones that he was using to play live at the time. So in 1969, he had the Telecaster, he had the #1 Les Paul, and he had the Dan Electro. But that was it. He didn't have an acoustic guitar that he took with him on the road, to the best of my knowledge, in 1969. There was no acoustic set.
Okay.
And so there's a set of photos from A&R Studios that I believe was in late June or early July of 1969, where Jimmy's playing a Gibson B25 guitar. And I think it's probably more likely that Jimmy used that guitar to record Ramble On, and not that E-Ros Dakota 606 guitar that I had previously thought he used and that Rick assumed that he used. So that was an interesting discovery. And I was able to kind of narrow that down by confirming those studio dates and realizing that what I believe happened with Led Zeppelin 2 was that Jimmy didn't have a whole lot of instruments at that point. He didn't bring them all with him. And so I think that E-Ros Dakota 606 guitar was not an instrument that actually even belonged to Jimmy. I believe that may have been a rented instrument or a borrowed instrument that he used just for that La La session.
Okay.
And then when he got to New York in July of 1969 to record Ramble On, and at Groove Studios and A&R Studios, those studios were within like a 5-minute distance to Manny's Music in New York, or any number of other music stores that he likely rented gear from.
Sure.
You see, so I mean, and so again, you got to remember, this is 1969. This is just them hard and heavy going through the material from the first album, and by April they were previewing Whole Lotta Love, and I think, and then just started putting in Heartbreaker in the set as they were writing it on the road. Right?
Okay.
So they didn't have, again, there's no acoustic set. There's not there's that's just it. There's he has White Summer, but he's using the Dan Electro for that in the set. So when you see the picture of Jimmy with the B25, and you also see a picture of Robert playing it at the A&R Studios at that time, that's much closer to the given date for Ramble On. And again, when you consider that you're right near all of these music stores, Jimmy doesn't mention in Jimmy Page the Anthology even owning the E-Ros Dakota 606 guitar or using it on anything. It doesn't mention owning the Gibson B25 that he and Robert are pictured with in July of 1969. So that tells me, that's kind of, we can kind of make a good guesstimate that he probably rented that guitar or those guitars, so that's my kind of thought process. And I'm just, again, we're not 100% certain. We don't have a photo that's dated from the day that he recorded Ramble On, but we do have a photo that's dated a couple of days before he recorded Ramble On in a different studio in New York, in close distance with each other. And I'm sure that they couldn't, because they're on the road, they're booking time where they can get time. So they weren't able to just go into one studio and get the hours that they wanted at one studio. I'm sure that they went from one studio to another and grabbed recording time between gigs, and that was the conditions under which Led Zeppelin 2 was recorded, so it was just kind of interesting. It just threw everything that my preconceived notions were thrown out the window when I realized that. And that made me realize, there's a strong possibility that Rick was not right about that guitar,
So
discovery. And I remember I messaged you right away. I wanted to tell you about it.
Yeah.
And then,
So can I just ask you a couple of things? So how particular was Page when it came to acoustic guitars? At what stage of his career with Led Zeppelin did he become particular? Was it the introduction of the acoustic sets?
I think it was
Clearly
I think it was Led Zeppelin 3
Okay.
would be where he was more particular because, you know, he recorded the first album using Mickey Most's Gibson J200, as we talked about with the nylon saddle tune-o-matic bridge, but that wasn't his guitar. He borrowed that from Mickey Most, and Mickey would not let him borrow that to record any of Led Zeppelin 2 with.
Sure.
And I can understand why. I think I may have mentioned that, you know, like that was even then was a very nice guitar. And I don't think I would have trusted Jimmy to go gallivanting around the US with that guitar and expect for it to come back in one piece, you know. You know, so that right there you know, and I know that Jimmy had a couple of acoustics. I know he had an acoustic 12 string that he'd used, you know, that he'd gotten like during the Yardbirds tenure roughly. He had, but his main acoustic was he had the Cromwell acoustic, which I know we talked about in one of our other videos. And then he had his main acoustic, which was the Harmony Sovereign H1260, which he used on primarily on the third album and the fourth album. And it was available and probably used somewhere on Houses of the Holy as well. So that was his main 6-string acoustic. Now by 1970, I believe he may have rented a Martin to take on the road in the 1970 tour, which is when the acoustic set started getting introduced. And that was like a real tentative step because, you know, it was hard because there were these big crowds. People were throwing firecrackers. They're wanting to hear A Whole Lot of Love. And, you know, the whole thing where they went acoustic and that threw some people off and people were, you know, yelling and screaming during the acoustic numbers. But they tried to introduce That's the Way. And it's like a mini acoustic set. They put in That's the Way and Jimmy playing Bronnerar.
Sure.
And that was, he used the Martin, and I believe, again, a rented Martin, because he claims he didn't get the Martin until the recording of Houses of the Holy.
Yes.
And, you know, again, photographs will show that Jimmy used the Martin on the entire 1970 tour. And I was kind of trying to figure out, is he confused? But then the idea that he rented one made sense to me. And then that he ended up buying one and then eventually two. By 1975, he had 2 Martin acoustics.
Yeah. So when you messaged me, I was thinking about a thing too that maybe we forget sometimes. Logistically, it would have been difficult. We've got to remember that these bands, these great bands, never had a huge entourage of roadies back around that 68, 69, 70 period, Al. So, you know, carrying just your main axes would have been a difficulty for, you know, for Page and the management. So having a couple of acoustic guitars, and we know it's a bigger case. So just even from that perspective, it makes sense. Okay, well, we're going to go on tour. We'll just go and hire. When we hit North America, we'll hire some guitars.
Right. Okay. And they definitely were doing, I mean, in 1969, in late 1968 and 1969, when they were touring, the whole band and their gear went in one van. And sometimes they would rent a car.
Yeah.
And so you're talking about, that's Peter Grant, the 4 members of the band, all of their gear in one van. You know, that's crazy. And so, and then, you know, recall you know, the stuff that he has, you know, by that stage in April of 1969, when the Led Zeppelin 2 sessions began, you know, he had a lot of amps. He had the, you know, the Vox UL 4120 head and the transonic cabinets, which are not small. You know, he had a lot of amp gear, the Telecaster, and then, you know, eventually the Les Paul. You know, so that's just Jimmy right by himself. Then you got Bonzo's kit, which was relatively small. And then you've got Jonesy's stuff. You know, Jonesy had the transonic cabinets. He also had like acoustic brand bass cabinets. He had all kinds of stuff. You know, so yeah, it's logistically not in the cards for them to carry this other gear that they would be using for recording on the road. So that's why I started thinking, oh, there's no question that they had to have, you know, rented some of this stuff. They weren't taking in 1969. They weren't taking the Hammond organ on the road either. So when you see, the Hammond organ in Olympic Studios, along with that picture with Page playing the E-Ros Dakota on the La La session, you also see the Hammond organ. Well, they didn't record Thank You there either, right? Thank You was recorded at a completely other date. So that's something that they would have had to have rented a Hammond organ at that point. So that, just kind of goes, they were renting at the very least. We know that they had to have logistically been renting a Hammond organ. They didn't cart that around everywhere. Like when you listen to the BBC sessions, 1969, you will hear Jonesy playing Hammond organ on that. But that was a BBC thing that they certainly either had a house Hammond organ at the BBC studios or they rented one just for the occasion of playing live on that show, and they use it for just the one number. You Shook Me.
And this is where the management and road management comes into play, doesn't it, Al? Because it's their job to make sure that that's included in the contract for the gig wherever they play, and that this instrument has to be available, set up, ready to go, because we clearly can't bring that organ ourselves. So
right.
That all pays into this whole thing of this organization. It's fascinating.
Yes.
Sometimes we forget about that.
Yes. And so that's why the pictures kind of throw us off, and we just think, oh, this is 1969, and that's a picture of him in a studio with this guitar, and the chord grip that he's using looks like it's a chord from Ramble On. Well, I thought it was Ramble On too, until Jimmy specifically said, no, that is not Ramble On. That is La La, this track that I just released on the Super Deluxe edition of Led Zeppelin 2, right? So that started all kinds of, wheels turning in my head. And then, the material changed. So they had done that. Since I've Been Loving You was one of the earliest things that they had for Led Zeppelin 3. And so they were playing that in very late 1969. And of course, they played it at Royal Albert Hall January 1st, 1970. Or January 9th, 1970, for Jimmy's birthday show that's been recorded, that's on the Led Zeppelin DVD that we've all seen. Okay.
Sure.
So, and I don't remember if they played Thank You at Royal Albert Hall, but I know that they played an early version of Since I've Been Loving You. And then during that 1970 tour, that's when Since I've Been Loving You got worked into the set, and Thank You. So at that point, I still don't know whether Jonesy was actually carrying around a Hammond organ or whether they were renting one in the cities that they were going to. At that point, by 70, they'd already had, some pretty successful albums, and A Whole Lot of Love had kind of broken through and made a big splash for them. So they may have had the wherewithal to carry a Hammond organ with them. That could have been the case. But then again, so that's how I'm like logically figuring this stuff out. Now it does make sense that they pretty much use the instruments that they owned for the later records, for like the third album onward. But
Sure.
For the first album and the second album, they were borrowing instrument. Again, Jimmy loved the sound of the Mickey Most J200 for Led Zeppelin 1, and he used it on the Julie Felix show, as we mentioned in the last time I was on. And but Jimmy didn't have one of those guitars. They were still back then very expensive, and Jimmy was happy with the Harmony H1260, and get when the acoustic material started coming fast and furious, he took to using that. And according to Jimmy, he used nothing but, for the 6-string tracks on the third album, and here's where we're kind of jumping into the third album. The 6-string acoustic tracks on that were, according to Jimmy again, and having owned one and listening to the record and learning those songs, I hear it as the H1260, as Jimmy has stated on multiple occasions. He says that he only had the one Harmony H1260, Harmony Sovereign H1260 6-string acoustic, and he used that for the third album and the fourth album.
Okay.
Point blank, that was the 6-string acoustic guitar for those two albums. Right?
Okay. So let me ask you a question then. So why then did he buy and or change to Martin guitars? Was it because of his experience playing with these rented guitars And did he have experience in playing Martin guitars when he was in the UK, do you think?
That's an excellent point. I don't think he had any experience playing any Martins in the UK.
Okay.
My guess is that he did rent the Martin for studio not for studio work, but for the 1970 tour. And I think he enjoyed the sound of that Martin that he did use live in 70. And in 70, I believe he left the Harmony H1260 in the UK and then just decided to rent the Martin for the tour. Having again recorded that's material. This is just really speculation, but my guess is that the whole thing of the Martin being used for the for the tour, he just might have liked the tone. It might have sounded better mic'd. It might have been easier to play. I mean, any number of reasons. I don't know why he didn't bring the H1260 on the road with him. He either left it in the UK or he brought it with him but didn't use it for live shows, and he just used the rented Martin for the entire tour. Because again, that acoustic set was in there from almost all of 1970. So
sure,
he probably did a long-term rental. I'm guessing did a long-term rental of the Martin. Either that or Jimmy's just way wrong about when he got the Martins. We don't see a Martin in his possession as far as in the studio. There's no pictures of Jimmy with a Martin in recording sessions until Houses of the Holy.
Okay, there's a great question here from John Conklin, our very dear friend, our brother. He's saying, why rent? Why wasn't he buying Martins in 1970? I think I might know why, but I'm going to throw that question to Al.
Yeah, my guess is that he didn't want to spend the money, and that really was Jimmy Page's thing. I mean, he's famously, everybody's going to say, lead wallet. And that's the whole deal, was that, Jimmy did not want to spend that kind of money. He was very much watching the purse strings,
And they've never been cheap guitars, have they? So
no, they were still, to get one of those was still pretty expensive back then. And the Harmony Sovereign H1260 was an inexpensive guitar that sounded great. And Jimmy, had that. The Cromwell guitar that he had was not an expensive guitar either. That was like a budget brand, type of version of a Gibson, so at that point, I think he got a little bit more into the guitar buying thing as he went on down the road. And some of those things, like I know he bought the 12-string acoustic that he ended up using for Over the Hills and Far Away. He bought at John, would it have been cheaper in the long run? Hard to say. Who knows what they charged to rent that Martin for the 1970 tour, if they did rent it. But the thing is that if I saw the Martin in his possession in any studio, if he mentioned it in any of the books or any of the interviews, because Jimmy has been pretty adamant about, I didn't have the Martin until 1972 recording sessions for Houses of the Holy, right? And the tone of the third album and the fourth album, it sounds like the darker tone. And of course, this is going by my ears and what Jimmy says. And, my ears could be fooled based on what Jimmy is telling me. But having learned the material from the third and fourth album, it sounds like the H1260. And again, this is something that Jimmy has been really adamant about. He posed on the cover of Guitar World with that Harmony H1260. He did the Metropolitan Museum exhibit, with that guitar, explaining its place and, when he used it, how he used it, So, it's a good question. But Martins were still very expensive. And I don't know what it would have cost to rent one back then. Who knows? They could have any number of things. He could have rented that instrument and then decided to purchase it at some point. I don't know. I don't think it's the same Martin though. He ended up buying two Martins. By 1975, he had two Martins. They were they were in a different tuning. For the acoustic set by 75, which had gotten pretty long, But so yeah, that's the thing. There was gear that he had in the UK that he just didn't travel with, but he had bought, and that was the other thing. You go to New York and you're going to Manny's Music, right? You're going to like the mecca of guitar stores, or you're going to Nashville and you're going to places where they've got nice guitars, but you could go in there and see these guitars that you didn't see in the UK, and
Correct.
so and he still was kind of reluctant to buy guitars back then. He would go to Manny's and try out guitars, and people were always trying to sell him guitars and get him to buy things. And he didn't initially want to buy the Les Paul from Joe Walsh. He did not want to buy the 12-string Guild acoustic that he bought from Manny's Music in New York that he used on Over the Hills and Far Away. He told the guy, I already have a 12-string, and he did. He actually had I believe it was a Martin 12-string.
It's a very English thing, Al. If you look at some of those English guys around that time, after World War II, the situation with the UK, England, as opposed to what was happening in the United States of America. We all know the stories. Keith Richards himself said it. It was black and white. It was drab right up into the 50s. The only color they had was rock and roll. Al. So this frugality that Page had, very much part of his generation. In fact, I want to add one little thing to the conversation, and Al was talking about, Page's reputation for being tight and squeaky when he walks. If you have a look at the Anthology magazine, the book, he doesn't throw away guitar strings. He's got all his guitar strings in boxes, Al.
Yeah.
so how many of us might take 2 or 3 strings out of a set and keep the other? Jimmy Page does, and always
Well,
has.
that what you see in the Anthology is his road case that he kept extra strings in, and so he just happened to keep those, not so that he would use them. It's just that he kept it all in storage. So he kept everything that he had, and he wasn't running around selling gear.
Okay,
right. So this was in the days when he quickly realized, hey, I can't. There's no way that we're going to have time to go to a guitar store and get some strings if I break a string. I've got to have a good supply of replacement.
Good point.
And so that's what that case is that you see in the Anthology. It's the strings that he had, and probably when he got home from the last Led Zeppelin tour, when he needed those strings, he just left that all in its case, and I remember it's like a big road case that had the individual strings laid out for him, But yeah, well, that wasn't him. That wasn't him like saving money on strings. But that is a common refrain, though. He again, we talked about in the Transonic days when he got the endorsement from Rickenbacker. It's like, they let him use the gear, and then he returned the gear but stole the speakers out of the the Fender amps that he had rented in the Yardbirds. He stole those speakers, and put them in the Transonic cabinets that he kept, and then returned. He did all kinds of crazy stuff to try to get get over on people, and there's so many stories of that. It's just and I understand what John's saying. Like, these days, let's say that I could rent a Les Paul. Let's say I could rent a Les Paul that would cost me like $5,000, right?
Yep.
And I want to use that on tour.
Yep.
I can go to the Cartage Company or whatever, or SIR, that kind of company, and rent that thing. Let's say I use it for, let's say I use that guitar for 2 months on tour during the summer or something.
Yep.
And let's say I'm paying like $500 a month.
Yeah.
Then I've only spent $2,000. I haven't spent $6,000 or $5,000.
Sure.
You know what I mean? Now it's anybody's guess if they did rent. I just, it's just an idea that I do think that no one has really ever thought about. And again, like I'm looking at the other pictures. I'm looking at that picture of him with the Gibson B25 acoustic at A&R Studios in New York around the time of the recording of Ramble On. And knowing that Jimmy has never once mentioned that guitar in any magazine, and it is not mentioned in the anthology. It's mentioned absolutely nowhere. And guess what? That E-Ros Dakota 606 guitar that he's pictured with recording La La is not mentioned in the anthology or any other place, you know. So yeah, it's one of those things where, you know, now when you put all this evidence and the photos and the studio dates and when specific songs were recorded, you know, and then you also recognize the fact that some of the early sessions were done at Olympic Studios in the UK. Almost all the other rest of the sessions were done on the road in the US, and then some follow-up recording was done towards the end back in the UK when they were finishing up the Led Zeppelin 2 album, right?
Yeah.
You know, so there's a logical sequence of events and knowing when the songs are recorded. It's kind of like when we were talking, when we did the 5150 show, and we were talking about 1984, and we were talking about you know, as Tanner had figured out the drop D tuning on Jump, and then I realized, oh, that probably was the Flying V, right? You know, then Tanner had mentioned, and I'd mentioned that, well, before the US Festival, they recorded 3 songs. And by Ted's account, they recorded 3 songs in one day. And that was Drop Dead Legs, which is the drop D tune Flying V. And then I'll Wait. And now I'll Wait has bass guitar on it. And the bass guitar is tuned to drop D. Okay. So Jump, logically, if they were all recorded in the same day or in the same rough time period in April of 1983, odds are that there was just the Flying V used for those 3 tracks, right? So you apply that kind of logic to what's going on with Led Zeppelin as well. You know, guess what? They're in London. They could rent whatever guitar from Denmark Street, and, you know, or whatever sort of, you know, company they had that rented instruments over there. If they indeed had one, they might have just as well rented something from someplace on Denmark Street. Yeah, so it just kind of makes more sense than looking at that one picture. And this is what I was guilty of this. And this is what Rick did. He looked at that one picture, but didn't know the source of the picture, didn't know the date of the picture, and didn't know that Jimmy had said, that is me recording La La on the very first session for Led Zeppelin 2 on April 14th, 1969. And Rick was not aware of the photo of him playing the Gibson B25 acoustic in July of 1969 when he recorded Ramble On. See?
This is what I love about this thing that we do, Al. This thing that we do here, you know, amongst ourselves and with our friends. You know, we see a picture and we think that photograph is solid proof. And it's great, you know, because photographs, you know, do give an indication. But the great thing about this photograph in particular is that Al has gone and done the archaeology, gone back and researched, read the material, linked it to what Page has said, and actually, you know, this is actually the case, which in turn actually helps the whole Led Zeppelin story. So what you've done, Al, is that you've put another piece of the puzzle in this Led Zeppelin story. Remarkable.
Yeah, absolutely. And now where people might have hunted down, because of Rick, you know, hunted down a Vox copy of the E-Ros Dakota 606, or other people hunting down old E-Ros Dakota 606s, which are, you know, kind of crap guitars that are frequently in poor repair. Now people might look for a late 60s Gibson B25. And
Yes.
that model was actually a very specific one that had Gibson on the Gibson logo on the scratch plate on the pick guard. And so that puts that guitar as having been, those ones were made only in like a certain period between 68 and 69. And of course the studio photos are from 69. That makes that guitar a brand new guitar.
Wow.
Right? A brand new Gibson guitar that, you know, they wouldn't have, probably didn't have in the UK, because it was very difficult to get Gibson electric guitars, let alone acoustics, in Britain. You know, so here he is in the USA. He's at a recording studio in New York City. He's near Manny's Music. where he could have gotten a Gibson, a brand new 1968, 1969 Gibson B25 acoustic for rental. He could have gone into Manny's and borrowed it for the session even, which they did. A lot of people were doing that back then. In fact, when Jimmy recorded You Shook Me and using the Gibson Flying V, right? We talked about that in our first show about Led Zeppelin 1. When he recorded You Shook Me using the Gibson Flying V that Keith Richards played at Hyde Park in 1969 for the debut concert of Mick Taylor and sort of the farewell concert, the memorial concert for Brian Jones, the guy that had that guitar let Jimmy borrow that guitar in the hopes that Jimmy would buy it.
Sure.
And so Jimmy did borrow it. He used it to record with. He liked the guitar, but he didn't want to pay what the guy was asking. So he gave the guitar back to the guy and was like, thanks, but no thanks. I won't buy it. And that, again, is yet another example of why Jimmy was able to use that guitar, spent no money, didn't buy the guitar, but ended up using it on a great recording, right?
So let me ask you this question. How realistic is the chance that a Gibson rep were hanging around back then, these recording studios, with these new No, it's not an option?
No, because
Okay.
Gibson would have been headquartered in, especially, and they still had, I'm going to say, where was it? Memphis. I think maybe it had been Memphis, Nashville, possibly. So a Gibson rep wouldn't have been in New York City necessarily going here, try this guitar, Jimmy Page. It would have been your regular old sales guy at Manny's.
From Manny's. Okay, so it would have been from the store. Okay,
probably,
so,
yeah. I mean, I say Manny's. There were other. There's like the We Buy Guitars. There was other places in New York City where you could buy musical instruments, but Manny's was far and away the big one, the one that all the rock stars shopped at. When Jimi Hendrix bought a wah-wah pedal, he bought it from Manny's. Okay.
So give us a bit of a scenario. Jimmy Page walks into Manny's. There's a cat there working at Manny's. He's got this new guitar, and he goes up to Jimmy Page and says, "Try this." So right. why would he give that guitar to Jimmy Page to try? What would he say to Jimmy Page?
Oh, he tried to convince him to buy it like any salesperson would. But then it was like, with Rockstar, even then, well-known players, it could have been like, okay, well, here, sign on this. We'll let you borrow it. You can check it out. Either that, or they may have, and I don't know if this is the case, but it may have just been like, okay, I just sent Richard Cole over to Manny's and asked him to pick up an acoustic guitar, or I went into Manny's and looked around at a couple of acoustic guitars. I know I want to record this acoustic track for Ramble On. I need a 6-string acoustic. I don't need anything expensive. We're just doing this. We've got one day to record in between gigs, and that's how Led Zeppelin 2 was recorded. They would play a gig, have one day off in between when they're going to a completely other city, and they, like if they played a couple of gigs in the New York area or in the Northeast, they would grab one day here and go and record in the studio late at night, because that's when the cheapest times were, because you're paying for you're paying for money. You're paying for the studio time, which was very expensive back then. But also it's like you're doing gigs.
Sure.
They probably slept for the rest of the morning and into the afternoon. And, and they were just getting up at 7:00 in the evening, and they probably went and, were working on sessions late at night. Jimmy, was really meticulous, and that's why we have the anthology, because that guy kept records of everything, because he was the guy that was spending the money. Jimmy Page was the purse strings of the band.
Correct.
It was all his money. He invested all of his money into Led Zeppelin. I mean, it's his brainchild, plain and simple. He was the guy that formed the band. He got the musicians together, him and Peter Grant, and Jimmy had the name the Yardbirds. Eventually that became Led Zeppelin. They co-opted that into getting signed, blah, blah, blah. But that was still Jimmy's money. So this is, not only was it that he was a frugal person in general, this was an investment from his own pocket So he was reluctant to spend money unless it really counted, unless it was really, really necessary. And he was always coming up with ways to not spend that money and get what he needed done.
And one thing too, I think we've got to remember too, folks, that just links into exactly everything that Al said. You know, we've got to remember that Page was a session musician back in the UK, so recording and having time on where he was recording was important as far as getting the paycheck goes. So, if he's not being diligent from that point of view, well, and not matching it, and if that's if there are inaccuracies with what he's getting paid, it's a business. I get it, Al.
Absolutely. He's the accountant. It's not really Peter Grant that's watching the money. It's Jimmy that's watching the money, especially in those early days. And then you also have to consider that, during the first, from the moment that Led Zeppelin formed, through 1969, Jimmy was still doing sessions. He was still making money doing sessions at the time, right?
Wow.
So think about that. So one of the first actual recordings of Led Zeppelin were not on Led Zeppelin records. It was on the Screaming Lord Sutch and Heavy Friends album, and that album was a session, and Jimmy got paid for that. He wasn't doing it for free. He also recorded, with a little help from my friends, the Joe Cocker album, on which he appeared, at least 5 or 6 tracks on that album. He got paid for that, and that was during Led Zeppelin.
Yeah, good point.
So he had to make money because he was the money. They had money from the record company, but I think Jimmy was astute enough to realize that the record company wasn't giving them money. They were, if they advanced you any money, you had to pay them back and then some, and then I'm sure that the contract that they had signed, was not the kind of contract that like Van Halen signed, where they, and Van Halen was totally oblivious to the money aspect of the whole business. They didn't understand how the business part of the music business worked.
Page did. But
Page 100% did. Yes, absolutely. Yeah. So this is just kind of more reasoning as to why they would have, or Jimmy would have either rented or borrowed, and it was part of a pattern in those early days. Again, he's borrowing Mickey Most's acoustic guitar to record Led Zeppelin 1. This is all kinds of stuff that's just right up his alley. So then when this thing of like, guess what? He could have rented these instruments, or he could have borrowed those instruments, and, again, he had the pattern. He borrowed that Flying V when the guy was trying to sell him a Flying V, and that Flying V made the rounds in the UK. That guy was trying to sell it to different rock stars in the UK, and there weren't that many Gibsons at all in the UK. So it was made total sense how, Jimmy ended up playing the Keith burst on sessions. Jimmy Page is pictured playing the Sunburst Les Paul with the Bigsby that Keith Richards used, right?
Yeah.
Those guitars made the rounds, and it wasn't that many of them, and there wasn't that many rock stars, at the time, so that, it's just kind of one of those things that started making a lot of sense. So, to me, I can't say 100% because we don't have cameras right there, but, the weight of the evidence is now tipped to strongly consider the Gibson B25 as being the acoustic used for Ramble On, and he possibly could have used a different guitar to record Thank You.
Okay, so we've already discussed that the Martin guitars, handmade guitars at that time, were relatively expensive guitars. Gibson too would have been, from, if I remember rightly, even more expensive, weren't they? They weren't cheaper than the Martins, if I remember rightly, Al.
No, yeah. Well, the better Gibsons and the Martins were definitely as expensive. I think the Martins were probably the most expensive guitars. Okay. But then you get to the Gibson J200s. You see, Jimmy probably would have liked to have found another nice J200 like he borrowed from Mickey Most. But those things were the very top of the Line guitar that Gibson made, acoustic guitar that Gibson made, So what he, the Gibson B25 is like a budget model guitar, though. That's not a fancy, expensive one. It was like, and again, you put yourself in the situation and all these surrounding events. It's like, okay, I'm on the road. I've got to record this track, ramble on.
Entry level Gibson.
Yeah, yeah,
Okay.
yeah. It's it's probably entry to lower mid level.
Okay.
Of that time, and so yeah, so it's and it wasn't the kind of thing, you saw people with Gibson J200s, but it was like Elvis.
Ah.
People that had a lot of money were running around with Gibson J200, Johnny Cash, people
Joni
like that,
Mitchell.
Loretta Lynn, people that had
Yes.
money for nice instruments like that, and then the whole thing about them being in the studio in New York, where you have the proximity of Manny's and places like that. Another kind of interesting thing about that is that, Manny's, like when Hendrix would go and buy a wah-wah pedal, Manny's carried Vox. Well, if you went to Memphis to buy a wah-wah pedal in the late 60s, you couldn't get a Vox wah-wah pedal there. And why is that? Because the music stores in Memphis were all Gibson people. Those were Gibson oriented businesses. So when you listen to like Isaac Hayes' Hot Buttered Soul album, 1969, those guys that were playing, Michael Tolles and, there's another guitar player. I can't remember the guy that plays on, say, Walk On By. And there's, lots of great wah-wah on that whole album. Well, that's a Boomerang 2 wah-wah pedal.
Oh my Lord.
So a lot of these country session guys that were doing sessions in Nashville and Memphis were using Gibson products because they didn't have Vox products. See what I mean? So, there's like also a proximity. So, if Jimmy was, say when they recorded Led Zeppelin 3 and they were recording at Ardent Studios in Memphis, okay? So a lot of Led Zeppelin 3, if not the whole thing, was recorded. And I think there's some of it was done in Olympic, I believe, too, Led Zeppelin 3. But a lot of it was at Ardent Studios in Memphis. So if Jimmy needed to get another wah-wah pedal in Memphis, Tennessee in 1970, he wouldn't have been able to find a Vox one, or it would have been very unlikely that you would have found a Vox wah-wah. So that's the same thing. Like, the country records, those guys and country people were using wah-wah pedals, and the steel guitar players were using wah-wah pedals back then. But they were using like de-Armand pedals and the Boomerang 2 again. I have one. Because I love the Isaac Hayes record. And my friend JD Simo had turned me on to the Boomerang 2 wah-wah. So I found one of those. I got a great deal on one. So I have those. And that's the wah-wah that's used on the Hot Buttered Soul record by Isaac Hayes. So, but I learned that, so there's, you're in New York, there's going to be certain equipment that you're going to have handy there, but not if you were in Memphis. Yeah. Or if you were in Muscle Shoals, Alabama or whatever, it's just kind of different, different stuff. So you have to kind of put yourself back in the time that you were in and think about, how easy it was to get this equipment and, how are you going to be carrying this stuff on the road with you? How's it going to fit knowing that there was only one van for Led Zeppelin in 1969? And, like there was a whole deal where I think it was, Robert Plant had told the story, like almost as soon as they touched down in the US, I think it was Richard Cole or Bonham was driving the van and they almost skidded and went off into a gully and the whole band almost died and lost all their gear, and all this kind of stuff. And that's how it was really ramshackle in those early days. It's like, Conklin, he's a Police fan like me. He knows the story of when the Police first came to the US and they landed here and, they're playing, CBGB and, playing the New York clubs. And, it was 3 guys in a van. That's all it was. They had their gear and they had their van and they had themselves, and that's how they did it. It in the early days of these bands, it was really ramshackle. Absolutely.
So the chances are, Al, then Page has used a high quality Gibson. He goes to the States and he grabs a Gibson, an entry level middle of the range Gibson, because it's got the Gibson badge on it, like all of us. So it's got to sound reasonably good. He's thinking that, isn't he? Because he's had experience with it. So he's thinking that this is going to be reasonably good.
Yeah. Yeah. And so again, there's not like, and people, when people think of Led Zeppelin 2, they don't think of acoustic music, you know, but Jimmy always rightly points out that Led Zeppelin 3 wasn't that much of a departure. There was acoustic music on the first album. And obviously we've got Ramble On and Thank You on the second album. Right. And then the unreleased track La La that ended up getting released on the Super Deluxe edition. Right.
Wow.
You know, so there's a potential that he could have used 3 different acoustic guitars on those 3 tracks. You know, the only thing we know for sure that La La was recorded with that E-Ros Dakota 606. Again, what I'm saying is that it's more likely that he used a Gibson B25 to record Ramble On in July. And who knows if he even used that same guitar to record Thank You. He could have used a third guitar to record the acoustic guitar part solo on Thank You. You know, so
there's another guitar.
Yeah, could be. That could be.
Wow.
Yeah. Yeah. So what this all is just sort of an addendum to the last thing we did and a jumping off point into the third album, you know. And then, you know, again, the third album is, you know, they get into a little bit more exotic gear and Jonesy's, you know, they're using Jonesy's stuff and Jonesy's got I think at this point, Jonesy got the Martin mandolin, and that's the mandolin that you hear on Tangerine and That's the Way. And That's the Way also has a mountain dulcimer on it. Jonesy's got his Vega banjo is on Gallows Pole. They're getting into more exotic stuff. The 12-string on Tangerine. And then of course they're getting into more of the 6-string tunings on the third album. So, you know, and then there's stuff that's influenced by Crosby, Stills and Nash, like That's the Way, and even Friends, you know, and Poor Tom, which was recorded for the third album but didn't get released until Coda in 1982. So, you know, so the third album, you know, ends up getting a little bit more exotic and got to stuff that they either were, you know, buying on the road, because by now they were feeling probably more comfortable. You know, they've had some success with the first and second albums, and they're making money from touring, you know, and it's not just, you know, and Jimmy is not doing sessions anymore. By 1970, I believe he pretty much stopped doing sessions by 70.
Focused completely on Led Zeppelin.
Right. Exactly. So that's my spiel for today, folks. That was just a fun thing that you know, made me think, and, you know, a whole other kind of avenue to look at. And it's an example of how, like, with anything that I'm studying, whether it's like, you know, Zeppelin or Van Halen or Robin Trower or anybody, whenever I'm discovering this kind of stuff, it's like I'm always learning something from somebody else or some other kind of thing that comes along. And it's like, oh, wow. You know, like when we did the 1984 show and Tanner figured out that guitar was in drop D, and that started this whole domino effect of, oh, well, now I'm going to go transcribe that song. I never once tried to learn how to play Jump, any of the guitar parts on Jump.
Well, that's going to give us a bit of an opportunity now before we end the show, ladies and gentlemen. I'll attach Al's channel on this video. If you're watching on a replay, Al has uploaded a video today of him, again, doing some wonderful archaeology on Van Halen. I ask you to go and have a look at it. It's fantastic. It's remarkable. And what I like about what we do here is that Al is saying exactly what guitar players do. You know, Keith Richards talks about guitar players weaving their music together, this tapestry of music. What Al is doing is this weaving of clues together to present a more, hopefully clearer, realistic idea of what happened in the past around this music that we love, and we love it, Al.
Oh yeah, it's so
fair.
fun, and it's so great when you know, to have you and have this show and have our friends that we have online and people that spark discussion, and that, you know, that like, you know, even another little example is like John was asking me, and I was trying to explain to him how to play little guitars, right? And
Yeah.
I was holding my pick in the way that I thought Eddie was holding it for little guitars. Well, I searched around some more, and like I found one guy who really didn't actually know how to play the song correctly, note for note, but he did understand how Eddie actually held the pick for that. And I tried it myself the way he described it, and I looked at Eddie's videos again, and I realized, oh wow, that guy was right. He had it right, and I didn't. So there's just yet another thing, that I never would have even, because it wasn't on my front burner, and I was pretty happy with the way I was playing it, and as far as I could tell by looking at the videos, it looked like that was how Eddie was playing it, right? But because John was asking me about it, and then I went and looked, and I searched a little, looked at some of the lesson videos, and here's 99% of them clueless. They don't know how to play it right. But one guy had one little thing right that set the whole thing off. And now that completely changed the way I play little guitars. And now it sounds so much more like the record than I've ever been able to get it to sound, So that's what's a cool thing about our little community and about your show and about the smart guys that are out there that, that I love to interact with, that get my brain going and, get my fingers moving and, force me to figure out a way to grab my guitar and, figure something out that I wasn't even thinking about,
Brilliant. Look, Al, it's always a pleasure. You have a permanent invitation to join us on here, and I've got to echo what you said at the top of the show. I know you're busy, and that's fine. Anytime you ever want to jump on a show with us, or we can organise these on the spot shows. Fantastic. I hope people that have been watching us live discussing this have been have realised a little bit of what Alan loves to do. This archaeology. That's the best way I can explain it. This archaeology of going back and sharing it with us. If you're watching us on a replay, please subscribe to our channel. I'm going to include Al's channel here on the description. So I ask you please to go and subscribe to Alan and check out the lesson that he's uploaded today. It's fascinating.
Cool. It's great seeing you, Andrew, and thanks for having me on again.
No problem. Top marks to Tanner too for that drop D.
Absolutely.
Well,
he is amazing. We're gonna have to do another. We're gonna have to do some more follow up with more from 1984. We just barely scratched the surface on that show, so that's another thing we should do.
Yeah, and just I'm going to say one thing. I think yesterday Conks mentioned that he said if you want the Brown sound for him, the Brown, it's 84. And look, I reflected on that. I listened to a couple of tracks after the show. He's bloody right.
Yeah. Oh, it's good. And John did a magnificent job of pulling up the Drop Dead Leg sound with his H9 and the Kemper and all that kind of stuff. Oh, it's great. He's done a great job with that. But I'm going to go help my wife with the groceries right quick. But it's great seeing you guys. Thanks for having me on. Thanks. Cheers. We'll talk again.
Thanks, guys. Thank you for hanging out with us. It's been wonderful. Guys, give me a second. Don't leave. I'm going to find Alan's channel, that video, and I'm going to put it here in the chat for you now. Give me a second. Let me find him. Hold on. Give me a second. See if I can find it for you guys. Messenger. Here we go. I think I found it. Where is it? Gosh. Hold on. Is it on his page? Did he put it on his page? No, he didn't. Okay, let me find him this way. Hold on, folks. Copy. I'll do a search. Here we go. No. find him? Can I find him? Where is his channel? Man, you're bad. Where's the description? Show more. Van Halen links. Hey, Garber. Make sure it's the right Garber. Is this the right one? Here we go. I've got his channel. Here we go. Hold on, folks. Videos. Jump solo lesson. I've got it. There it is. Cut. Are you still there? Are you still there, folks? Here it is. Go and check out. That's the link there for Alan's jump solo lesson. Excellent show. Thanks, Phil. Thanks, Jimmy Ray, for joining us. Charles, thank you. Thank you for the donation that you sent to the channel. Fantastic. Brody, good to see you, brother. Dan of New Jersey, fantastic. Thanks for hanging out with us. John Conklin was here. Outstanding. Robert Ranford, outstanding pics of your 5150, bro. Love to do a show with you. Guitar Hack, our friend from Canada. Awesome. John Conklin, thank you for hanging out with us, brother. Tim Thomas. Jay, 7/8 was here. Johnny Bean. Who else have I missed? I think that's everybody. Thank you for hanging out with us. Go and give Alan a subscription. I'll see you guys in about 7 hours' time with the Rock Professor and Brad ranking ZZ Top's Eliminator. Bye-bye.